to the Grog Talk with your hosts, Dan and James.
Welcome to Grog Talk, episode 8, and hopefully you all see that we're a little bit different today. We have our my friends from Smog on the Nog. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
I'm Jordan.
Hey guys, I'm Brandon, and just to elaborate a little bit, we run a podcast where we talk about things that just generally make for good conversation. That's probably the easiest way to break it down. And we figured there's a lot of good conversation that can be had with Dungeons and Dragons. So
Yeah.
Sure.
So Brandon, you're trying to center on your screen. I've cropped you a little bit, so if you could move to your left. Oh, there you go. Perfect. There you go. Now you're right.
I'll be leaning the whole time now.
Okay, exactly. I can move you over, but so I'm a subscriber to Smog on the Nog, and I've listened to a number of their episodes, and it's just interesting to see how their take on what's history to them, but it's things that we lived. And so I started communicating with them, and we talked about Dungeons and Dragons and how it came up in the 80s, and specifically about the Satanic Panic. If you've heard a couple of their episodes, they're always looking at some kind of angle or how people perceive a greater force behind it. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to talk about that. And I first would love to hear your guys' take on what you think the Satanic Panic was, and then I can give you what I remember, because when it started, probably I was like 10 or 11 up through my early 20s, and I was pretty much still playing pretty consistently.
Well, from what I remember, and what I saw too, it isn't like the actual Satanic Panic. That phrase came from that whole situation with like the I forgot the family's name, but it was like that whole regressed memory situation. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where they like there was a bunch of like murders and bad things going on. So this family started they like went to these therapists, and that's where they came up with this whole regressed memory. They started saying crazy stuff that they did that they didn't actually do, and they attributed it to like this satanic panic that swept the nation, and it was all garbage. Everything that they had confessed to, none of it actually happened, and that definitely got
memory.
That's what I said.
Repressed.
Oh, when I say regressed, right?
Well, they are regressed memories,
regress,
but they're
Repressed regressions.
It was regressive and it was repressed.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, like you said, I only know it through the scope of hearing about it. So when people talk about it regarding the past, hindsight is 2020. Everything was so ridiculous, and why were people so out of control with all of this? But the science on repressed memories and the occult and everything wasn't as advanced as it is now. So it was a lot of people just trying to learn that whole effect on the brain and bad science regarding psychology. And so I don't really have the lens of it of like, oh, what is this new thing that everybody's talking about, and is this really real that people are being part of the occult and they don't even know, and then you have to go see a psychologist to bring it back up? Like, do I have repressed memories? Am I I don't have that lens. I only have the lens of like, look at all these mistakes people made along the way in their thinking.
Yeah, I think the just recalling that time, psychotherapy and psychology was really becoming. It was moving away from the exploits of people who had a lot of money. There was this idea in the 60s and 70s you would go to a psychiatrist, but that was the purview of the neurotic and the rich, and it was becoming more mainstream. And again, the challenge for people who lived there was no internet, so there was an air of legitimacy. The idea of it was on TV, just like a book. It was thought of, well, this must be true. No one would publish something that was complete nonsense, or at least that was the perception of it. And you started seeing it in the talk shows, similar to what you see today with herbal medicines or these type of things on Dr. Oz or whatever things that you guys have done research on. So all the talk shows started having daytime talk shows started having people who had repressed memories, and so this idea started to formulate, and it came at a time when this idea of you were normal, but everyone else wasn't, and that all this weird stuff people were doing. It was before Jerry Springer, but you started to see all these kind of people in Middle America, wherever they were freaks of nature, and it was this idea that you were fine, maybe a couple of your neighbors were fine, but someone out there was sacrificing babies, and as someone who was a child and then a teenager, all the things I liked were being lumped into the Satanic Panic, whether it was heavy metal music, whether it was Dungeons and Dragons, whether it was computer games, but that was came much later as far as violence. So
I mean, that explains a
really
lot about you, right?
Right. Well, that's right. I mean, I haven't sacrificed anyone in a long time.
Right. You've repressed it.
That's right. I've repressed my killing. It's been a number of days. Well, actually, it's not true. We played and I killed an NPC elf. But besides that,
there you go.
no players were hurt in my last adventure.
See, that's the part they didn't account for, is that you could get your killing out through the games.
Right. There was this, and like you said, Brandon, that this idea of the mind was fragile but could be manipulated, and there was just these thoughts, and empirical study was not as important. I think the whole social sciences that has been happening and the challenge of repeating experiments has come into question, and some of that's really been the biases of the researchers, and I'll leave that to you guys to talk about. That's more your take, but this idea, again, people would get on Donahue or Oprah. They were famous talk shows at the time. I mean, Oprah's still popular, but and they would say these things, and people would be like, wow, that's really true. So yeah, it was interesting time from that. And again, I have a different perspective. When I grew up in New York City, and then I moved to Florida. So I think there's a little, the culture changed when I moved.
Well, I think it's funny too.
Right.
They gave these weirdos basically rock star status, because at first these people were nobody, and they were going on shows and they were embracing it, like the people that were speaking for the satanic community. Because there's these satanic churches and stuff. I see some of the clips and they're hilarious, because they're obviously like, this is my time to shine. And like you have like the people like is it Anton LaVey was one of the big ones in the 80s. Like then you start giving these dudes rock star status, and then of course the rock stars themselves. And this is in the 70s too with like Led Zeppelin, but then they knew the mystique of it, so they kind of they played to their strengths as well with it.
Yeah, I remember, just real quick, that because again, rock music, metal, heavy metal, but particularly rock music, a lot of the evangelical, because then you also had televangelists at that time, and I forgot the show. I wish I would know the clip, but I remember watching, you're flipping the channels, and this guy was explaining that the songs don't end, they just fade out, and because they fade out and they don't cut off, it's this kind of infinity. And that's a very demonic thing. Songs should just end.
Oh, no.
God is beginning and an end. But things that just keep going on forever, and then they would play the songs backwards. And they've been doing that for 25 years. So anything that was new was perceived as some subliminal message. So yeah, it was like, what do you do? They didn't have crack back then, but you would think they were.
I love the one that's like, who is it? It's a famous song. I love those backwards ones. The ones like, smoke marijuana. It's like, that doesn't sound like anything. And it's like stretched over 5 seconds. Like, smoke marijuana. It's like, see, this is smoke marijuana. I saw this guy break it down for like 20 minutes. He was just going clip to clip to clip. And just like, no, this is this. And he's just rattling them off, playing them with a tape recorder. He's going, boom, plays it. And he goes, this is this, this is this. He's like, oh, see? Sacrifice babies. And it sounds nothing like it.
Well, I'm going to replay this backwards, and I'm sure it's sacrifice babies. Kill everyone.
Oh, and that's the funny thing, is if you hear it the first time, you go, I don't know what they're saying. But then they say, okay, now did you hear them say this? And then you listen again, and you're like, oh, I heard them say that. Oh, my gosh. Like, you didn't hear anything.
Yeah.
I think it's audio pareidolia. But
yeah, take a 3-minute song plus, and then like play it backwards.
Just listen.
Yeah, and it could be for any amount of time. Like I was saying, it doesn't have to be like in a like a normal rate of speech. It can be like very stretched out. It's be like, see,
Well, what's funny is those musicians. It was kind of a counterculture thing. It was to rebel against, that's kind of how rock and all really music is. So they could have just put it into music, and people would have still listened to it. So to think that they would have had to hide it in there, like,
But that was a meme, or I wouldn't call it a meme, but that was a trend that also came out of the 60s and 70s. The idea of subliminal messages. There was movies were, because again, obviously 24 frames per second, it provides the illusion of motion. And there would be studies that showed that, movie theaters would eat popcorn or drink Coke every, flashed in there. And there was a movie that came out, They Live.
Yes.
I don't know if you've heard that one. And that was a cult classic, and it came out, I was about 14 when it came out. And this idea, that aliens had taken over and we were being bombarded with subliminal messages. And it's, these kind of individual points, but there was this culture of paranoia. And particularly you dealt with the existential threat of the Soviet Union. We had The Day After, that famous movie that made-for-TV movie that was apparently was so terrifying that even President Reagan was concerned about it, and that was the first time like, oh my God, we're going to get completely annihilated. So it was this constant dread, and it kind of blended in there, and so people are looking for excuses, and clearly we're not the problem. Apparently, there's Satanists running around causing all these issues, or communists, commie Satanists.
right.
They're
Well, the
synonymous.
communists are Satan. Yeah. So.
there's always comfort.
Right. Well, they're
And
godless.
there's always comfort
Yeah.
in the supernatural. It seems like there's always, like you were saying, putting it on something else.
Yeah, and I wish I had written down all the things, but it was a cataclysm of like a lot of stuff. There was the big war on drugs, which also targeted a lot of the people that involved in the music industry and Dungeons and Dragons and everything, because they were like the youth. And there was obviously the whole red wave. There was the evangelicals, like you had said. So there was like so many things that it was just like perfectly coming together, and it was like right on the turn of really starting to discover some of this psychology behind everything. And that probably led to a lot of the discoveries we made in the psychology, to be honest, because there were people behind the scenes going, this sounds awfully fishy. Everything we know about memory, although it's not that great, doesn't really lead to this conclusion that you can just hide memories away. And I think in like some very, very rare cases, it might be possible, but we've never really demonstrated it. But people just like latched onto it. Like you said, as soon as it was in a book, it was official. And you just had all these crackpots writing books. That was like, anybody could write a book, I guess.
So my recollection, when I, in the early 80s, I was, 12, 13, 14 before I moved down to Florida. And some of my family lived down here. We would come down on vacation. That's where I actually started playing Dungeons and Dragons. I was over the summer. And I was at the local bookstore. We picked it up, and there was no warnings or, explicit lyric kind of thing like that came later. And it was an innocuous, it was already a strange game. You didn't have pieces. You didn't have chess, you didn't have figurines like this, right? You had to, there's no board. And so we really enjoyed it. Went back to New York, started finding some folks who played it. And the only thing I remember from that time was this movie called Mazes and Monsters. And it had Tom Hanks in it, who I had seen in Bosom Buddies in the early 80s. It was a sitcom. There were these two guys, and they needed to get I think they was trying to get a cheap apartment, so they dressed as women, so it was kind of a cross-dressing. It was this sugar, bubble gum comedy. And I was like, oh my God, Mazes and Monsters, great. They're finally going to show Dungeons and Dragons, and it's going to be great. And I'd already been disappointed. Well, I was about to be disappointed in a couple of years. So I watched this thing, and for those who are out there, my suggestion when I do the suggestion part is you should watch Mazes and Monsters, because if you think some of your entertainment choices are bad now, imagine on primetime TV you have to watch this. They have no understanding of how Dungeons and Dragons works. I guess maybe they were worried about being sued by the company TSR because they had nothing related to it. It was kind of like a knockoff, and it was the acting was horrible, and it didn't even portray Dungeons and Dragons badly. It just portrayed life badly. It was a horrible portrayal of it, and I was so disappointed because I was like, yes, finally something I care about was going to be done well. And then like 2 years later, the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon came out. And I don't know if you remember, like the A-Team and a lot of shows during that time, they'd spray 150 bullets at someone, no one be hit. No one got shot, no blood, no nothing. I was like, this is ridiculous. How can they shoot 150 times? Well, that's how Dungeons and Dragons was, the cartoon. It didn't make any sense, and it was just a continuing disappointment of why is the things that I care about being portrayed so ridiculously? And I'm sure other people were like that. I'm sure when, I don't know if for rap or hip hop, when some of the movies came out, you could tell when movies were made by people who knew what they were talking about and people who were just trying to commercialize it. So then I moved down here, and that's when I was getting older and started seeing some of maybe it was because of the culture here in Florida versus in New York, but we started to see some of those other aspects of on TV that this was a satanic bent to it. The Mazes and Monsters was just crazy people play it and you're going to die. I came down here and it became, this is the gateway drug to Satanism. And there was always that push-pull, because right in the early 80s, we had Venom came out, which was a heavy metal band, and they're black metal, sell your souls to the gods of rock and roll or something like that. It was over-the-top, ridiculous Satanist music. And you kind of were like, ooh, Satanist music, that's kind of cool. I should get that. But you're like, is it really Satanist? In some ways you're hoping it's like wrestling, right? You hope it's real, but it's not, but you still enjoy it. So that's kind of what we had. And Iron Maiden had Number of the Beast, which came out and had a big devil on it. So, they were exploiting us for that time. But you always had that thing of, is this, again, I was a teenager. Is this really true? If this is, how far do I have to get to? What level of understanding before I, really trip over and become,
It's like Scientology.
the guy who right, exactly. It's that I know it's a game. I know this is silly, but maybe there's something in here that I could actually find, this Gnostic kind of understanding. So, yeah, it was always in the back of your head, or at least for me. I'm sure others completely discounted. And then as I got older, I wasn't too worried about it. It was more of a game. And then I realized, at least at the time, if I wanted to grow up, quote unquote, I needed to move on. And then, for 25 years, I didn't play. So
You missed 25 good years of satanic practice.
right, I would be probably a level 18 Satanist now.
Well, the irony
Now
is
I'm just
you graduated to mastery of Satanism when you moved to Florida, because Satan lives in Florida. So
apparently.
that
Yeah,
was your
and-
gateway. Your gateway was moving here.
Right. Well, some would say, some people who don't like Florida think it is hell. So, yeah. And the other thing that had come out that I definitely remember was the child abuse scandals at the daycares. And so you want to talk about repressed memories, that there's these cults of Satanists running child care facilities with the purpose of molesting and sacrificing them. I think it was like McMartin thing in 1982, and that happened for years and years. People were
That's
getting
what I was referring
arrested.
to.
That's
Yeah.
oh, okay, yeah, and they were on every daytime channel. So you had that, and then you also had the suicides. There, I was a big metal fan, still am. Judas Priest, Ozzy Osbourne. Some of their fans would kill themselves. So Ozzy Osbourne had a song called "Suicide Solution." That was the name of the song. Probably, if nowadays he wouldn't write that, so he wouldn't be sued. But the thought, it was about, supposedly, I'm sure it was about trying to have innocent youth murdered. But what he said the reason of the song was to commemorate Bon Scott, who is the singer of AC/DC, Antichrist Devil something. That's, by the way, what AC/DC means. At least that's
I've
what we were
also
all
heard
told.
it means you go both ways, so they're trying to convince people to be gay.
Ah, gotcha. Oh, that's a good
Yeah.
one.
I thought it was
like
the
that.
electrical,
Next,
like the alternating current. What is it?
Right. Well, that's where they make the connection from the AC/DC,
That's
because
cute.
the electrical currents and something about flowing both ways.
Oh wow.
I mean, you have to suspend belief a little bit when, or at least your connection to reality.
Yeah. Antichrist. Yeah. So it was like Kiss was knights in
Oh
Satan's
yeah.
service. We heard all this, and I'm not sure. Again, my mother didn't really care about that. She wasn't too concerned, but I'm sure other parents, and it's the same thing. Whether it's M-rated movie or games or R-rated, you want to sell more. Actually, putting that label gets it. So, um, they had Suicide Solution. It was about Bon Scott who drank himself to death, and it was about drinking and slowly killing yourself. But there were a couple of lawsuits where they basically, in the Judas Priest case, it was the song "Better by You, Better Than Me" was the name of the song. It came off an album in 1977, Stained Class. And the same thing, they would have audio experts slowing the thing down, and they're like, it's like, and it was like, he said, "Do it right there." That was "Do it," like commanding this guy. And apparently, and I don't remember exact details, but I'm sure people could look it up. Where these kids are listening to music, and they decide, "Hey, let's blow our brains out with a shotgun." One kills himself, the other one survived after getting shot, if I recall. So I don't know who was worse in that situation, but that was part of it. And the same thing, it was, I don't know what was more distressing at the time, the lawsuit and that it was ridiculous, or watching my heroes having to dress in suits going to court looking like, businessmen. It was very not metal.
Right.
So it was a tough time. I really don't remember a lot of positive press from that. And any kind of thing that you embrace, on the one hand, you want to keep it as yourself. You want to, at least when I was younger, this is mine, or this is for my folks or my people. But you also don't want it to be dissed or whatever by those who don't understand.
It's interesting because there was also an overlap of the child abuse and everything with the alien abductions. So that a
Oh
lot
yeah,
of people claim to have been abducted and molested by aliens, when in reality, and whenever they went to see their therapist or whatever, they wouldn't always bring up that it was aliens, but the therapist would lead them towards aliens. They would be like, "So, like, did you see flashing lights and everything?" So it was kind of, that whole field was really having a rough time. And it probably had a lot to do with them just not really having a solid, you know, I don't know, structure, because there was a lot of stuff they still had yet to learn, and there was a lot of people putting their own beliefs into it, obviously, which is where the whole satanic part of it came, and the aliens, with people wanting to believe that there's aliens, or I'm sure in some weird way it fits their narrative that aliens are molesting people, so yes, there must be aliens. But now we know a lot of
yeah.
that is not repressed memories, it's just people trying to feed their narrative onto somebody.
But I've heard on your guys' podcast this, when it crosses from these random crackpots to becomes legitimate. Uh, the thing that was, I don't remember the time, but Gary Gygax, who was the co-founder of Dungeons and Dragons, co-creator, he was on 60 Minutes and having to defend that his game wasn't. And you're like, 60 Minutes, really? I mean, when it was on Oprah, or not Oprah, I keep disparaging. Was it Sally, Jesse, Raphael, and Donahue and those kind? They were talk shows, but 60 Minutes was one of the most legitimate shows, and they were saying basically, so why do you want all children murdered and sacrificed, kind of thing. I'm paraphrasing, and so how does that tie in from what you guys have seen? How does a conspiracy move from being crackpot to legitimized? So this was pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook,
I feel like they
YouTube.
have to somewhat pander to their audience at the time. Like I don't think that would fly now. Just with I mean, they would probably get ridiculed for that. But like, um, it was probably seen as a lot more legitimate then because of how much traction that, um, just the whole whatever Satanic Panic, and that specifically that mom, her last name is Poling. I want to say Patricia Poling. Um, because they interviewed her on the 60 Minutes, and like her son committed suicide, and she like created this whole like instead of like mad like mothers against drunk driving, it was literally called bad BADD. It was like something against Dungeons and Dragons. So she was like getting traction, getting this movement. There's getting articles. So um, if the I don't know, like I said, I think it's just like pandering to the sentiment at the time, the overwhelming sentiment.
It was bothered about Dungeons and Dragons.
Bothered. That's hilarious.
Bothered. That's right.
I mean, they couldn't have picked a more perfect name for that group when you picture them. We're bothered.
I'm slightly
We
tiffed.
were really bothered. I'd like to speak to the
Well,
manager of Dungeons and Dragons.
Bedeviled by Dungeons and Dragons, which would have been a little better.
There
I
you
think
go.
I think probably the two biggest factors for me that led to it spreading would be one, fear. Fear spreads everything. It really doesn't matter what aspect of life you're talking about, but if you can get people afraid of something, that's when they start trying to that's when they really start like arming up basically and getting all of their groups together to go out and go against it because they feel like something's going to be taken from them or the world as they knew it is going to change. And then the other thing is I think it was kind of a breakdown of authority figures. So people looked up to therapists and people looked up to anyone who had gone to school and been educated. People looked up to the media and people looked up to police officers because there was also a big campaign of police officers promoting the satanic rituals, and I don't know what their motives were. Maybe some of it was belief related because I know they found that a lot of the districts that were promoting it most heavily were also the most evangelical. So I'm sure it had an aspect of that. I'm sure an aspect of it was probably funding because if you can promote this big new fear, then you can get more funding to go fight this fear even if it doesn't exist. So, and I know they even had the FBI look into it because I was reading about that, and he found that basically any of the discussions of the police departments of Satanism and witchcraft uh, somehow led back to religious belief in their audience. Faith and not logic and reason were governing their decisions. So, and that was from the actual clip of this guy Lanning who went and did like a big report in 1989 on it. So I think if you get a lot of authority figures in different areas to start telling the same message, people will just start believing it because you don't have time to go look into all that. If you're an everyday person and you're just going to work and worrying about what your kids are doing and everything, and you have all these different sources, you got the media, you got police, you got your friends, you got your church leaders telling you, hey, you got to start watching out for this. They're trying to get your kids. They're trying to. You're just gonna believe it because the risk versus the reward. It's better to just believe it and not try to go do your own research and everything. So it's kind of their duty to make sure they're giving you good information.
Yeah. Well, so what is the satanic cult of 2019? What is the ever-present bugbear? Yeah, ever-present bugbear that is enticing us and bringing us to moral depravity. I kind of live my life now, and I've raised my kids and I play D&D and do my thing. I don't really pay attention to. I've tried to, except for GROGTALK, I don't do a lot of social media, so I don't know what the trends are of this. But that was the ever-present thing. It was either communists,
That's back,
Satanists.
by the way.
They were they're unknown. Yeah, they were unknown, but they were omnipresent. They were everywhere. And again, that's why that They Live really had that resonance. It wasn't a great movie, but this idea that these secret society had permeated everywhere. So what is that from your as younger people? What is that bugbear today?
Oh, you can go.
Well, I think personally it's kind of been broken into two things because of how, and now we're going to make this D&D podcast political, but
Yes.
I think basically the two political parties now are so divided that they see each other as that.
Yeah.
They each see the other group as the one that's going to be the one that destroys the world as they know it. So it's kind of become like the political aspect of it, because one side sees the other as like hateful racists who have no empathy, and the other side sees it as like these ultra progressive people who have no values and just want to change the entire structure.
Yeah, I will say one thing though. It's like since news is happening at such a fast pace, like every piece of news is an outrage in some regard. That's like it's almost impossible to actually get movements going. So that's kind of a good thing because it's like, just wait till tomorrow. Like something else will be, you know, talked about or outraged about. So that's one good part. I don't think you're gonna have, um, even if 60 Minutes does a story on something, like it's forgotten about the next day. So, but you do have that. I think like just kind of what Brandon's saying. You do have the satanic panic aspect of these both political parties, but just as a whole, it's like, um, just politics in general has become this like lame like soap opera that everybody's tuned into. It just annoys me, but that's my own thing. I don't think that has to do with the question, but it's just annoying. They got
Yeah,
everyone bought in.
yeah, no,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah,
Yeah.
good. I was just going to say that, part of that was, and I've listened to your podcast about conspiracies, and, the first one I listened to was about the Steve Jackson, which again, GURPS and all these games we played, Munchkin, these were games
Did you
that
play
we
the Illuminati one?
played.
Did you play the
I'm
Illuminati
sorry?
card game?
I did not. No, that came out after I was into video games.
That was
at
when he
that
was
point,
growing up already.
Yeah, I was
That's
part
when
of
he
the
was
corporate.
VP of bad.
Uh, yeah, I was part of Malak and the corporate machine to sacrifice.
That's what he was marketing
because
for
again, every
Beelzebub.
enemy, right? Lord of the Rings was a even though Tolkien said it wasn't, this analogy to World War One and the mechanization being evil versus naturalist, and this the challenge I was, after the Satanic Panic, we went to the terrorist attacks, and then they became, because it still goes back to the same. If you have an evangelical religious bent, there is an ultimate evil, and these are just streams off the same evil. They're just different versions
Right.
of it, and in the game, it's funny, in first edition, there were devils and demons in there, and there were various names of Satan.
Right.
They didn't have Satan, but they had Beelzebub.
Mephisto.
And, okay, Mephisto. Okay, nope. So far I'm okay. Nothing's happened. And demons and pentagrams, and it was,
Spells.
spells, and so it wouldn't take much for someone to figure it out. And then in the second edition, which is by the time it was moved on, they really tampered that back because there was such a pushback on, the style of play changed. You went from, you could do whatever you want. It was a very kind of gritty, I don't say realistic, it's a fantasy game, but kind of, you weren't superheroes. The second edition really focused on, you were superheroes fighting for good. Yeah, you could play evil, but it was really meant to do that. And if you played first edition, if you played an evil character, your soul, if you were a human, would be then used in become a larva, and then eventually you'd go up the demonic or diabolical food chain, ultimately trying to become a demon. So there was that threat of, oh, you see, this is why people are trying to do this. They're trying to learn the satanic rituals so that they can move up in the pyramid scheme of Satanism or something
Like
like
it's
that.
just an
So
MLM.
you
have to get 5 friends underneath
exactly.
you.
You can multi-level marketing, yeah, for
Boss babe.
Satanist Inc. Yeah, if you guys can book
Satanic
that.
boss
That's good.
babe.
But right, exactly. So it all trended back, and I think after the attacks of 9/11 and the World Trade Center, you had Islam, radical Islam, being the boogeyman, and I guess politics is the boogeyman now, but that still doesn't feel like a nefarious cult. No one they're not saying, ooh, the Democrats or the Republicans are meeting at CPAC, I guess they were at this week, and in one of the rooms they're praying to Baal and sacrificing children there. Or Pizzagate, wasn't that
Yeah,
Pizzagate? Wasn't that one of
for
those where it
sure.
was kind of
Yeah,
like that?
that's a modern. That's I mean that's literally modern day Satanic Panic. But here's the thing too, like
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
when you're talking about all these different names and stuff. This is what intrigued me about when we did the Illuminati card game one is like like you had said, this was pre-internet, so there is this like um, there's this. It's helpful if there's like this forbidden knowledge aspect. It's not like some kind of just blind belief. Like you're learning all this stuff. There's a lot of research been done, and you see that like when you just see like some random white dude from like Alabama goes and joins ISIS because like it's kind of the same thing. There's like this forbidden
yeah.
knowledge aspect, all these like new concepts, like that kind of gives it some mystique and appeal.
I always
Well,
I
yeah.
was gonna say I always like the history of where a lot of this stuff comes from too. So when we talk about what's the Satanic Panic now, sometimes I think about what was the Satanic Panic before that. Where did it all originate? Because I guess it's kind of always been a thing, so it probably always will be, and that probably does play on the fact that fear and ignorance are always going to be prevalent because we don't have time, like I said, to search into everything. But we had talked about it the other day about how just the origins of the word demon alone was borrowed. It comes from ancient Greek, and the original ancient Greeks just used them as like supreme beings of knowledge. It wasn't until Christianity came along and was like, well, we can't have them looking up to these other supreme beings. These things are bad now. So then they started including it as bad. But even in Plato's early writings, he says that demons were what inspired Socrates. So they weren't necessarily revered, but they were like respected. But then the Christians came along and were like, as much like they did with the Romans with holidays and whatnot. But they also was the other aspect of that I
Well, that
forgot.
that is a knowledge in a sense is a demonic aspect or attribute. I think.
It's true.
I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I think that's kind of part of the. That's where you can get kind of in these philosophical loopholes or religious loopholes sometimes, because like you can always kind of fall back on that. But I think that is like a kind of this underlying belief is that like the knowledge itself, like the goal isn't to be as knowledgeable as possible in a weird way, because that
But there's always been that
yeah
push pull, right? That's Garden
right
of Eden.
Right.
exactly
They got kicked. Prometheus. It was knowledge that you should not
right
have, and or man should not have. Excuse me. And that idea of Gnosticism, which is this hidden knowledge, and that those who have it, that's, and again, I'm not. That's your guys' realm of Scientology and cults and everything else. I look forward to seeing more of that. But coming through this, um, whether it's the game or things like that, it was other, and and then you see the people playing. I know you look at me and go, wow, this guy probably was very popular, had a lot of friends. No, we were kind of nerdy and geeky still. And if you look weird and you act weird and you say things in weird languages, I'm a level 3 magic user. Not
Put them
going
on the
to,
stake.
yeah, not going to engender you with a whole lot of sympathy. And I think that, and one thing I will say is, even though the internet, quote unquote, what we know of, by the late '80s, early '90s, there were internet like, it wasn't the World Wide Web, but you had things like AOL and its predecessor. You had the Prodigy. You had people dialing up to message board services. So that part had started in the '80s. So people were sharing more knowledge, but it was still underground. And chat IRC has been around for probably since the '70s, because I think a lot of universities had it, but it wasn't to the population that it has now, where everyone is
that's when it was
accessible.
cool. I wish
So
that's the part that we missed out on that I would have liked to been a part of. That's when it was like more, it is like almost everything's forbidden knowledge in a sense that's being shared, whereas now it's like it's kind of I don't know, just corporate and watered down.
I believe my stepmother, this was 83, 84, had an account to CompuServe, which was you basically dialed this central computer and then it phoned home to other ones. And, you know, it was basically messaging. So there was some, you know, there was definitely more of that, but it was a very, you know, you had to have a computer and a phone line. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't pervasive. Not everyone had a
Right.
smartphone. So,
And they tended to be smart people or
it was
successful
different.
people, like, or it wasn't like, you know, it wasn't a human right that everybody just had.
Yeah, and or universities. You had to be at a university and be part of that culture. So it was there were small areas of it, but it was getting out there. But you know, really, my first recollection of a ubiquitous internet is probably 96, 97, when people started really feeling like, oh, I have to have a computer, I have to get on the internet, and it was a nightmare because, you know, the idea was you dialed in and then you didn't know where to go. You didn't have Google. You had to go, and if you didn't have AOL, which was this hosted environment for you to kind of go out of, you had to figure out where you were going. There was
Ask
no
Jeeves.
search. I think, well, I'm sure there was a time where there was no
Right.
Ask Jeeves, right? There was literally no Alta Vista, no anything. And so AOL or Yahoo became these gateways that people used to get out to the internet. You know, think of just researching the topics you do. There's
Right.
no Google. You have to
Library.
just try to start looking around, going from site to site to figure out how to get there,
Well,
or going to chat rooms.
in a lot of ways, I'm glad that the growing pains were kind of experienced by the previous generations, because you guys had to vet all this bad information that ended up on the internet and in mainstream news and everything. And we've kind of been blessed by all those mistakes, because now we have people that are aware of the faults of our minds and whatnot, so we can use those resources if we want to. Not everybody does, but at least it's available. Whereas before, I mean, you had maybe one person write about it that would get famous 50 years after they die, but it wasn't like,
Yeah.
oh, there's this huge sect of people that are actually familiar with the inner workings of our brain and why we fall for, you know, conspiracy theories like there's a satanic cult stealing your children and sacrificing them. So I'm glad that I didn't have to go through all that. I mean, I only vaguely remember having poor internet and everything and having to use like a phone line or whatever, but
A phone line, yeah, poor
yeah,
internet. 56K was amazing.
right. But I didn't really have to experience that as somebody who's like actively on the internet. So thank you for your sacrifice.
Well, and you know, it's going to be, you know, when you get to my age, what are the things you've experienced in the last 5 or 10 years? What's going to be the vision of them with the passage of time? You know,
That's true.
I would remember, you know, we felt, and now I'm at an age where I can say this. You know, my parents thought they were riding dinosaurs, and you know, they had black and white TV. Oh, what horrible! We thought we were pretty modern. You know, we had video game consoles and computers, and you know, you could search for things. It was, and you know, 56K baud. Well, that's pretty good. I'll be curious to see what you all think when you're my age. The things that seem so important that, you know, in hindsight, they're either trivial or, you know, the passage of time has changed their perspective, and then you'll be on whatever the Generation Z talk, that thing, that you'll be the old whippersnapper. Well, when I was a podcaster, we had to upload ourselves. Didn't no embedded chip to do that.
We'll all have
Get off my
neural
lawn.
implants. Well, even with podcasting, I feel like it's got podcasting similar to the internet. Started off as a lot grittier, and it is kind of one of the last bastions, though, of like, it's not really well regulated, which is nice, but I'm waiting for that to happen any day now. But it's like, I don't know. I don't know if it's cynicism or what, but I always look fondly at like the beginning of especially internet related things. It's like, you know, you kind of want to find it in the beginning before it's like, you know, every corporation and their mother finds out about it and have to be advertiser friendly, and then it has to be this, and then it gets boring.
So you're a computer hipster.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not cool as soon as once everyone has a podcast, it's not
Yeah.
cool, right?
Well, not even just that, but it's like,
yeah, exactly.
I hate to sound like it more of a hippie than a hipster, but when I say like, what's the corporate side of it gets in, that's when it just gets more like, it just becomes, I don't know, it kind of.
You're not using enough mans
corporation
when you're talking like that.
But it does, because when I'm saying like advertiser friendly, or when I'm saying these things, it has to be like, it loses its edge in a weird way. Like YouTube, it's like, you can still find some cool channels, but for the most part, what's actually promoted and what's, if you go to the trending, the most popular, it's because it has to be family friendly for everyone. You have all the like the Tonight shows and whoever is spending the money for it. It's like it kind of loses sight of the actual creator side of it, which podcasting, you could still anybody can do it, but what's promoted and what's given life in the beginning is if you have a corporate backing, you can go in and you're hot from the start, which is fine. But it's like it just, like I said, it loses sight of like the cool creator aspect. So you just got to find new avenues, or we start our own internet.
So I think, yeah. I'm sorry, you have something, Brandon?
Yeah, and you can probably speak on this better than me, but I think we're probably in a weird situation right now where YouTube has a monopoly because they're the ones with the resources to run something like that. But it's possible in the future that it's not that hard to run a system that has servers holding videos. I mean, it's just right now that the startup cost and the maintenance and everything is so difficult that it is hard for somebody else to really get in on it. And because Google's so massive, they have the backing. But it's possible that in the future that's not really an issue because storing the videos might be much more efficient, regulating the videos might be much more efficient. It's hard to tell what competition will bring and what technology and advancements will bring. So I'm not too worried about that.
Right.
Well, yeah. I think in my other life, my other job, which I know for those who watch
Dungeon Master?
this, D&D is not my job. I don't get paid for this. My other job is in technology, and you would hope so, but the history repeats itself, as you guys have demonstrated many times in your podcast. We had the railroads. Once they got large, they became robber barons, and they worked to suppress innovation. And the same companies, it was Microsoft when I was growing up. Once they became Microsoft and Intel, tried to knock everyone out. So the encouraging side is Google and all these other ones still were able to break out. But every new behemoth tries to use its monopoly power to prevent others. And so perfect example is Google. When you type in Google, you assume you go out to the internet, you go to the Google server, and you come back. So if you guys wanted to set up Smog on the Nog search engine, you'd set up a computer and do that. The problem is Google has gotten with all the internet service providers and put their servers inside their data centers. So when you hit Google, it's faster than it would be going to your site. And that's the whole net neutrality versus that. And is it really for freedom? Because of course, who wants restricted internet? That sounds terrible. But is that the purpose of it? So I look forward to hear you guys talk about net neutrality and the balance between corporatism, corporate welfare. That'll be a 3-part series. I look forward to hearing about that and getting your take.
We got the hottest
honestly,
takes.
Huh?
I was gonna say we'd be better off talking politics than talking about that with how mad people get about internet.
Well, that's another thing too. It's like when
That's
when I was saying that sarcastically about the hot takes, but it's like I don't want to hear unless like most of these concepts, like that was something interesting that's a fact, but like I'm so sick of hearing people's hot takes that like is literally the most obvious thing in the world. It's like I guess in the case of net neutrality, you'd be like, well, I think just given like the most fair-sided view of what it actually is. It's like the whole. I've talked to you about it before. The whole common sense, like, look how common sense I am. Don't want to hear it.
Well, it's neutral. Don't you want to be neutral? Who wants?
Yeah.
It's in the name. Why wouldn't you want to
Oh,
do
that
that?
would be a great
So,
episode too for the naming conventions of all the different bills and laws that they try to get through. Oh, we'll just name it something nobody could possibly vote against.
Oh yeah, there's some
right.
creepy stuff.
So I think this is a good place. Unless you have other questions for me, or I don't have any. I appreciate your guys' take on this. Your not hot take. Your deliberated take. Your meandering take. Anything from me? Anything we didn't cover from your guys' perspective for your
I mean,
audience?
I'm curious what your idea is for what the current Satanic Panic is. I don't think we got that.
I think from my perspective, I don't know if politics in it. I think that's kind of a label that people use to ascribe certain things that they're antithetical to them. So you look at a party, and those who rally around it for those who want it, they see it as all the reasons why the world is falling apart. And so my opinion is now we've moved past Islamophobia. I think there's going to be something about this convergence of technology. If self-driving cars and autonomous robots and this really starts taking forward, something is going to come out of that this next generation. You're already seeing the tech backlash. I think there's going to be almost an anti-tech movement. We're seeing that with Facebook. We're seeing that with Twitter. This idea of people wanting to gain back their control of their lives because it's spinning out of control. I don't know if it manifested into a group per se, but I think that's the next thing, especially when you potentially have mass unemployment because of automation, which we've already seen some of it, but if that accelerates, and more globalism, which causes disruptions in economics. So I don't know what the thing is called, but at some point it's going to go back to, like the one world order type of scenario, and it will, if you're a religious type, it will be Satan that is the behind it.
Right.
Babylon.
You sound like a
I think you made me
shill.
change my answer though, because you just made me think of something else, which is
okay.
people's fear about government monitoring. So, and that kind of ties in with the whole technology, because a lot of people see as technology gets better, they see the government's ability to surveillance improves, and there's a lot of people. I mean, it is a rational fear at the surface, which probably most all things are at some point. But you see people just extrapolating to the extreme, and it's like, now the government knows what's in your cereal, and maybe they're even controlling the ingredients and everything. So I think as technology keeps improving, people are going to continue worrying, and that might even be a real fear in the future. But right now, I know that there's no way they can keep track of all the information, even if they were gathering it all. There's just no possible way they could be storing it and monitoring it. As algorithms get better and maybe storage space gets better, then maybe we do have to start worrying.
I disagree wholeheartedly.
So they've convinced you.
Yeah,
Talk about globalist
exactly.
shill.
They've done a great job.
Yes, I had my bowl of government soup this morning.
Did you just saw that Google Home got caught having those cameras or extra secret microphone in them? That just came out this week. I disagree wholeheartedly with that statement. The views of Brandon do not reflect on the Smog and the Nog sentiment.
Yeah. Well, but that's almost the cyberpunk thing, which was a game. Cyberpunk, that motif of cyberpunk, embracing parts of technology but rejecting what seems to be the culture and the structure of society that would be generated from it. So, I'd be curious if you guys looked over Cyberpunk. Maybe I need to do a review of Cyberpunk at some point. And because that came out in the 80s and 90s, that whole Blade Runner.
They just remade
kind of
that game, or are they making a new game? Or
yeah, I think it's a newer version of it. Is that, from your guys' perspective, in line with what you see? Because that was kind of the thought of, and even though some of it back then had, I think we were talking about off before we started, I'm sure they had cassette decks and hard drives like they had in Rogue One, where they're trying to pull hard drives off. They're really, you would download the Death Star plans on a hard drive. Really, that's the best way you could do it.
Well, I think that's a
so
great
I'm curious
point
to see that,
because a lot of the ways people don't count on technology making an improvement is things like prosthetics and like our ability basically to just either function when we're not previously able to function because of a birth defect or some accident, or being able to push ourselves to an extreme. So, and I know that's where they've been making progress with the whole BCI, the brain computer interface. But the idea is you're going to have a chip in your brain that's able to control arms and legs and whatever. And it has improved a lot. You know, it's not perfect, but people can have a computer chip and move fingers and things like that. So, where do you draw the line between there's people that could have a real benefit of that, and there's people that go, oh great, we got Manchurian candidates running all around with Terminator arms and legs.
Yeah, I'm not signing up for that. In fact, I'm going to form a group bothered about brain-computer interfaces. That's going to be my group.
Are you guys hiring?
So, I'm sure we'll have a
They don't
Kickstarter
hire
for
you, just
that.
have to prove how radical you are.
Right, right. I just need to have my ferret was killed by the brain-computer interface, and now I'm going to try to prevent
Are
that
you
from
willing to
others,
blow up
so.
Skynet?
I
Yeah,
just like
that's
when
right. Skynet. Well,
I
that's
was
so
just saying,
funny.
I
Go
just
ahead,
like when
Jordan.
Hollywood tries to portray hackers in the cyberpunks. Those are always great compilations
Yeah.
to watch.
Well, yeah, I went into IT and it was the same. You know, I watched The Net, Sandra Bullock's
Oh,
The
geez.
Net, and I was like, this is the most ridiculous portrayal of technology. And it was, you know, anytime you have this niche thing that you do, and Hollywood or you want to you want that be legitimized, but yet they don't. They ruin it.
Well, they
Again, the
ruined
hipster
that
thing.
with
So,
trying to make a Dungeons and Dragons movie. Remember, we saw that in theaters, right?
Yeah.
oh yeah.
I think they made like 3 of them.
Yeah. Well, there's been a few. There's been a bunch of home, brewed ones that people made, and I just can't. I can't
Jeez.
watch it.
Well,
I can't watch other people play Dungeons and Dragons, and I can't watch those shows. It's just so
But it's
depressing.
you know what's funny is the
really not
video
that
game
hard.
influence from Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, so many of my favorite games still, like the new Divinity and Divinity 2, are like. I mean, it's straight up Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, you could put your own spin on it, but like, it's I don't know how many people know this, maybe that are our age, but I mean, it's literally just a like a visual interface version of Dungeons and Dragons, like how the dice rolling, the die rolling hits and everything, and like I'm wondering,
Yeah.
did Dungeons and Dragons literally start like pretty much what everybody knows as RPGs? Because it's a dice roll or die roll, whatever, and but obviously you don't see it sometimes. Sometimes it's like it's just digital, but that's literally what the hit is like a dice roll. You know what I'm trying to
Right.
say?
Yeah, it's and there's plenty of material out there, but it is the game that's why it's still the most popular in many ways, because it is the game that's founded the idea of moving away from. It was the amalgamation of a tactical game, whether it was fighting with soldiers or mutants or monsters, and having you portray one of them and have them progress and have a story based on it. And that whole, the first Dungeons and Dragons first released one was in 1974. And, so you're talking 45 years of this and 2 or 3 generations. So Lord Garriott, Lord British, Richard Garriott, he did the Ultima series. That influenced people like from BioWare, who did the D&D Baldur's Gate series. And then that moves into the games that you've seen. One of the most popular streams is Critical Role, and these are all voice actors who play D&D, who've been on all these computer games. I didn't know them from the computer games, but they're like, my kids are like, oh, that's McCree from Overwatch, or that's the voice of this person. You watch the credits that they have, and they play Dungeons and Dragons. So I think it attracts creative people, or people who want to express themselves. And what's interesting, we're in this renaissance, which I'm very happy about, but as a grognard, I want to stay on my lawn in first edition, but I'm happy to see people taking this. It almost feels like we're back in the
Really?
70s, that in that, I played yesterday, and there's plenty of people playing. There's 6 or 7 tables
Wow.
full of younger people playing. This idea of getting together socially, that the experience with, just even though we have online and we have HD 4K TVs and we can stream and collaborate with a bunch of people out the world, there's something still visceral about sitting with other people in that social setting. You know, that primal sitting around the campfire and telling stories. And I don't know how familiar you are with role playing games. Does it have an interest? For people of your age.
Definitely with Brandon, since he's a nerd. No, I'm just playing. I like to. I mean, I just like it's just a big time commitment. Like because I know it has to keep.
Yeah.
It's a continuation story, but like video game RPGs, I love. And I think you're right. That's a super positive. People are getting together to play it. I mean, that kind of like goes against this entire narrative of like, oh, the new generation aren't social and this and that. Like that's a complete opposing argument. So that's awesome, and it definitely breeds creativity. You have to be in the moment. It's like improv.
I
Yeah,
honestly
yeah.
find it kind of funny that the video game industry is shooting them in the foot, shooting themselves in the foot because they've really done away with like the couch co-ops
Yeah,
and even just co-op in general. I mean, Jordan and I ran into that problem last night. We were trying to play a game that we thought was co-op, and then it turned out it wasn't. And we're like, well, we'll have to play on separate systems and just talk to each other about what we're experiencing.
yeah,
It's okay, but it would be way better if we were playing together. And D&D gives you that
Yeah.
aspect of like, here we go, we're about to do this together. We're about to meet up every week and play the game. And I don't know why, but video games have really been doing away with that. Unless it's like some massive battle arena or something, but there's something really fun still about doing a story mode along with somebody
I
else.
feel like a lot of that's a money hook because they know they want if there's any kind of multiplayer ability, they want you to buy the game as well. Which is cool about D&D or those type of games is like you're not really on the hook for anything else. Well, maybe you buy the book or some pieces, but like you bring that to the table, and there's no hook to like, okay, we got to keep having you come in, and that seems to be like every business model, entertainment or not, right now. It's just like, how can we keep them on the hook?
Yeah. Well, this is a very, I was at the game store, and the front half of the game store is playing Magic the Gathering collectible card games, where
That's
you
an
have to
inexpensive
if you're
game.
going to be active, you have to spend money. And then the back half is people playing Dungeons and Dragons, which it's not a inexpensive. You could technically play for free, but once you buy the core books, you really don't need to spend a whole lot of money. So I think it's a hobby that allows people to be creative. It's not super expensive. You can, if you want to spend money, it's just weird. It's like a lot of things that were taboo. People, all the stars of rock, they're now on commercials. You've got Joe Manganiello, right? The guy, he's a big D&D nerd, and Stephen Colbert. There's all these celebrities who've, you know, I could never see Patrick Swayze or Charlie Sheen saying he played Dungeons and Dragons in the '80s. That would never happen. Vin Diesel's played Dungeons and Dragons. Terry Crews plays Dungeons and Dragons. None of the heroes or the stars of the '80s would be caught. Madonna playing Dungeons and Dragons. No,
Right.
that's not going to happen. So I'm excited about that. I think there's a lot of value, and there's other kind of games. It doesn't have to be. I think the oldest is the best, but there's a lot of interesting games. And I haven't done enough research in modern games, but I think that would show you, just like the conspiracy game, what is the things that people are interested in. They want to use role playing to flesh out what they think about it. That's I don't know enough about that, and that would be, maybe we could do a
What do you
follow
mean?
on where we look at modern games and say, what does that say about society today? Because that's what the role playing thing does. It helps you flesh out um, some things you couldn't do in a normal
Right.
setting.
I think another beautiful aspect of D&D that probably gets overlooked is that it's, in a way, it's open source. So you show up with whatever you want to show up to, and then every single person there is contributing to the story. So you're never going to get the same thing twice, and some things you'll take from that game and apply it to other games going forward, whether it's like homebrewing characters or rules or whatever. So you kind of have millions of people just like adding their own flavor to this story. So it's like a big game that everyone's making better collectively with their own thoughts and ideas, and then you go into online forums and you go, hey, that's a great idea. Or you see a rule that you don't know, which is kind of what you guys do every week with your podcast, and say, hey, we found it on the forum, we found the answer.
Yeah, and D&D is a common language, but you can tell your own story, and I've had different styles. I tend to like the older style because that's what I'm familiar with, but hopefully I can continue to branch out because I don't like it's a game, it's a storytelling vehicle, but it's still a game, and there's a lot of folks who have now moved to it's really just a way to tell stories and less about dice and combat, and I'm still want to play a game where there are things we can do, and during the adventure and what your characters do and the interaction with your players, that's what dictates it, not some overarching plot that you're basically showing the players to go through.
Right.
But that's another podcast for another day.
Well, and I agree with you there too, and I don't mind so much if there's not dice rolling, as long as there's something you're having to think over in your head. But if it's just laying out story, then it's like a Charles Dickens novel where it's like, okay, we've got all these words and everything, but where's the meat of it? Or I don't need that. That's the one thing I remember of Great Expectations. It's like 10 pages describing the food sitting on the table, and you're like, okay, but can we advance the plot a little? Is there something I can think about? So yeah, I definitely like the dice rolling. I guess it's innate human. We love dice rolling, but
Yeah.
I also love that somebody gives you like a moral quandary or something that maybe you don't have to address it right now, but as you're approaching the crossroads where you're going to have to address it, you're thinking, okay, what is the benefit? What's the negative? And maybe they're introducing more things that will change the way you think about it as you go along. So you have your decision all along, and then you're like, oh wait, that really just threw a wrench in this whole. So I like that aspect of it as well. And that's kind of the beauty, is you can approach it from a lot of different ways, and I know you guys have talked about that too, but you just kind of have to know what the people are playing are like, and then cater it to them.
Are you saying that it's become more storyteller centric just because the people who are doing podcasts and YouTube, that's kind of what they're trying to showcase?
Yeah, I don't know what begat more storytelling. So my understanding of the versions is the last edition, which came out. We're on the 5th edition. The 4th edition was very, for those who don't, Diablo, which is a video game, or World of Warcraft, which is a multimedia, massively multiplayer game. Very tactical. Each person had a role, and you kind of went through it. 5th edition was a throwback, supposedly to 1st edition, in that you kind of made up the rules. It was very light on the rules. The result of that, because of the internet and Twitch and streaming and podcasts, what makes for watching someone play a video game for most people. Now, again, you younger people like esports, so I don't get it. But this idea of story trumps the game playing, and now it's become people are trying to replicate that. And so I'm very curious to see when the 6th edition comes out if they're really going to go completely to storytelling and really minimize the role playing. And there are tabletop systems that don't even have dice. Fate, I think, just uses basically you can get chips or something like that. There's some randomness, but it's downplayed tremendously. And so for what's the challenge of Dungeons and Dragons, like Microsoft Windows. It's so old. It's been around. They have to keep trying to make new things, but cater to the old people. So I've listened to other podcasts like, why do we have hit points? They don't make any sense. Or what about armor class? Some of these things that were invented 45 years ago, but if you get rid of it, you're not playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Hey, if the Bible can do it, Dungeons and Dragons can do it.
Right, hey, and they're still number one, baby. So.
I can just see you raging in the car. What do you mean? What's the hit points for?
That's right.
Well,
it's an abstraction of the ability of the character to survive conflict. It's not that complicated. I mean, even Gary Gygax wrote that out. But people, and that all things full circle. There were games in the 70s where RuneQuest, which I've played it, and there's in England, they that was really a game they embraced because it was D&D was the license was a little squirrely. It's a very deadly game because there's a lot of rolling, and you would basically the sword would hit your arm, and it would have to get through your armor. But if it did some damage, all of a sudden your arm wasn't useful, and it took so combat would take a long time and it had to be avoided because you were going to be most likely maimed or killed. And so this constant and the idea of Dungeons and Dragons was really more of a storytelling thing, and now we've gone the opposite way. The D&D has become more storytelling. There's been backlash. People are still playing Pathfinder, which was an offshoot of Dungeons and Dragons, because it's very tactical, a lot of rules. So the good news, the optimist in me says, there's a game for everyone if you want to play it. The pessimist says, everything's being appropriated.
I was just gonna say cultural appropriation.
Everything gets appropriated based on the culture
Terry
that we have
Crews
today.
Trying to cultural appropriate my game.
It's yeah.
Oh,
well,
now the buff guys are playing, huh?
Right. Well, you've got the jocks that thing, and then unfortunately, I know you're going to probably find this shocking, but if I were to say the gender makeup of D&D players probably skewed towards people who associate as males, probably, I don't know, 90-10, and I've listened to podcasts, and I think it's a good thing, but it feels like appropriations that we need to have pictures of people represented in the books there. So, Wizards of the Coast is in Seattle, so take that for what it's worth. Whereas D&D...
So soon we're going to have Nikes on our Warriors.
Yeah, TSR was from Wisconsin. And, I didn't think it was overtly sexist or racist, but there were things in there that you could construe. And one of the big ones, just now we've completely gone off the rail, which is part and parcel of the Smog and the Nog, is in first edition, if you were a female human, you could not be as strong as a male human. If you were a female orc, you could not be as strong as a male orc. And, I'm not going to get... You take it for what it's worth.
Well, here's my thing, though. Isn't Beelzebub like 10,000 years old and genderless? So it's like, what about that? That's the first transgender.
That's... I'm sure it was. Yeah. So that's always been, and so now you can, and that's the idea of, well, the character should be able to do whatever they want. But that's if there's no rules, and you can do whatever you want, then it's storytelling. Then
right.
I'm just going to be I'll be a wizard who's half this or that. So anyway. I do think it's a little silly, and maybe because they've amended that, I'm guessing. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I do think it's a little silly that you're living in a fantasy world where, like, your characters are already performing ridiculous feats of strength sometimes. Why put an arbitrary, unless you're trying to inject some of your own opinion into it, why put that arbitrary rule in?
But aren't they better at something else if they're less in strength? Like, I'm sure. Oh, okay.
No.
Well, yeah. That's hilarious then.
It was a reflection of
the good times.
I'll just say common observation of the world.
No, and I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying, why even bother? What if you're going to base it on reality, there's a lot of things you got to take out. Why are people casting spells and?
Right. Well, they didn't make intelligence less, though other races.
You wrote in.
And again, then you take it to the extreme of, are these races, proxies for racism here?
Oh.
And then you guys do some research and call me back, and we'll get into all that. But I never saw it that way. An orc was an orc. It wasn't a proxy of. This wasn't Planet of the Apes kind of an allegory to the '60s and racial tension. This was an orc's an orc. They're evil.
Right.
And that's even moral relativism. Originally, the game had this idea, good and evil, law and chaos. Slaughtering orcs was not a bad thing because they were evil, they would murder all you. you move into this alignment is this idea of you have this worldview that is not changing and there's consequences to it not changing. That's kind of, it was a hassle. So people are like, it's better to be moral relativism.
Right.
And so it still has an alignment, but it's not as
Did they start that whole
clear-cut
thing?
as it was then.
Wow.
Alignment, yes. That there's all the things. Yeah. So to your point, Jordan, these are the tropes that have been injected in what everything role playing and games that and other
Every
things that we see
role-playing
today.
game.
Well, it is funny because the way I interpret it, obviously you played with the first edition, so you kind of see it as them just saying, this is just more of a hassle than it's worth. And I see it as maybe them adjusting for the complexities of the natures of human and then obviously mystical creatures. But basically they're saying there's not really fine lines in much stuff, so we want you to have more fluidity between how your characters behave and be able to play the characters better. When it was originally created, it was like, here's the rules, follow in these lines and everything. And it was still about the storytelling, but I guess there wasn't as much storytelling, whereas probably generations now, they appreciate more of like the complexity of the characters. And I think you probably see a lot more now, people really getting into the characters. And not everybody has to play like that, but having the fluidity of the um, alignments allows people to better role play that, because in reality, people rarely fall into they're all good or they're all bad. You can, in
Right.
fact, I would say they never fall into that line. So it allows them to have a little bit more leeway with that, and I think it's an interesting point too, because it kind of connects to like the whole depth of story. In the first edition, you really didn't have, you had a background of all the world, but you didn't really have that much. Now it's to the point where like you can pick any random thing and it goes all the way back, and then people inject their own on that, and they've got tomes of history on some of these characters. And you see that happening with like the comic books and everything too. And the comic, I mean, look at our movies now. It used to be just a one-off, here's your Captain Marvel movie or whatever. Now it's like, oh no, there's 10 movies that lead to the background of this movie. So it makes me wonder what's happening with society where people like much more complexity to the story.
Because we've seen everything 10,000
Yeah,
times,
yeah. Well, I hear what you're saying. I guess my take on that is so alignment in first edition and subsequent edition is a mechanic. It has a thing in the game. If you're good and you fight evil people, you may get bonuses or negatives. In my opinion, alignment only makes sense if you have that the gods, whatever deities, are real, and that they are personifications of their worldview. So just like Satan is a personification of evil, he's not Milton's Satan from paradise, rather to rule in hell than serve in heaven kind of thing. They are truly malevolent. And because of that, your characters have a worldview. They're religious. And again, this, part of it is our society's less religious than they were, where you try to aspire to a certain worldview. So it was probably made a lot more sense. I think the backside to, at least back in the early days, there was a game called Traveler, which you were basically space faring role playing. There was no alignment. You could do whatever you want. You're either a lawbreaker or not. The challenge with that is the same challenge when you have evil parties, I use my open quotes again, in Dungeons and Dragons. What is the social contract that's going to allow you to move forward? If you're immature, then what happens is, as soon as I get an opportunity to take you out, I'm going to, because it devolves into this kind of paranoia game. I think that part has been more progressed. People are willing to deal with the social contract to continue moving the story, and they're not using the alignment as the way to bind that. But at least when I was growing up, if you didn't have that, there was consequences for me to do something against what I did, then everything fell apart. You wouldn't have a campaign, because halfway through, I would take your magic item, and from then on, you'd be like, okay, I'm going to try to kill you because you took my stuff. And so I think there is that opportunity, but Captain America is still, he's lawful good.
Right.
I mean, he has moral quandaries, and that's what makes it interesting. Because if he wasn't lawful good, the things he do, that's we all then debate that when he does that, is it still in
yeah.
his alignment? And that we could talk about
You're
that
right.
for 3
No,
hours.
that's really
Well,
interesting.
and it's funny though because he's lawful good in the sense of his actions, but if you were to stick purely to the Dungeons and Dragons, he wouldn't be able to associate with the people he associates with because he'd be railroaded into these. No, you can't have friends that are neutral for a certain amount of time. Basically, he'd be able to help Iron Man once and then be like, sorry, we can't be friends anymore. So I think
Yeah.
well, at least that change right there was good because you don't want to have a bunch of people that are like, no, we're all doing it's good to have a little bit of conflict.
Right. I'm sorry, Jordan.
Oh
You were
no, I
going to
just
say
think
something?
that's really interesting. That was all.
But using that example, so there's a class in first edition Paladin, which is what Brandon's kind of alluding to, that they couldn't associate with people. And this idea of you have this worldview and you think it's correct, shouldn't you be trying to influence others about it? It's that thing of, I found the secret. You know those people, right? They want to tell you about it. I found the secret to life.
Now I
And
just pictured Captain
if
America selling essential oils.
right, he's selling democracy, peace, justice, the American way, right? That's his idea. And is it best? That goes back to all these groups. If you're part of any group that feels like they have the truth, there's always that difference between, do you involve others who are not believers and you interact with them so they become believers? Or if you do that, will you be part of the world? The Amish, right? They let their teenagers go off to experience things because they're like, better for them to experience and then come back. So there's a whole thing of that, which again, I've given you like 5 weeks of things for you to talk about with that. But Captain America, he is a personification of truth, justice, and the American way. And what makes him interesting is when he has to make moral choices between his hierarchy of priority and loyalty to his friends versus his understanding of, yep, that's right, truth and justice and that kind of thing, or Superman or any of these. If they were more, if it's all Han Solo was interesting, but he was more interesting he was more interesting from a character perspective when he was a rogue and you didn't know what he was going to do. His challenges were more real when he became, chaotic good or whatever you want to call it. And for those who are alignment, don't know what we're talking about,
Oh boy.
plenty of things about the alignment.
Well, yeah. The funny thing is, it's probably an easier transition for people to hear your podcast mixed with ours than people who hear ours to mix it with yours, because some of them are like, what is this D&D terminology? But if they want to get the basics on all of that, they'd have to go listen to you. So
that's right.
And in fact, I'm using a lot of your own logic against you, just so you know, because I'm completely caught up. So in hearing you and Dan talk about it, I'm like, yes.
Yeah. Well, but for me, because again, first edition's a game first. And if the storytelling should be generated from the game, not the overarching plot as the game master, the referee that I'm trying to do. I set up the scenario, I let the players try to figure out the characters, the players yesterday. I didn't know what was going to happen. I just set the stage, and the great event is when one player paralyzes the dragon, he falls out of the sky, and he kills him. I didn't know they were going to do that. I had no idea. But if I set this plot where the good dragon would come in and attack the black dragon, the bad dragon, and you save the party because that would be epic. That wasn't as good as what happened at the table.
No,
and
nobody
that's the
likes
challenge.
Deus Ex Machina.
Right. The whole Eagles thing when in Lord of the Rings every time. So and that's the challenge. As the game master, if you're putting this whole story in and all the players are doing, they're just witnessing your set pieces. And you start seeing that. Some of the streams talk about you have to have a chapter 1, act 2, act 3, and have this all planned out. And I don't look at that way. And that's why if I ever stream D&D, there'll be 3 people who watch it, because it's like a bunch of guys and gals, which we have girls, by the way. We have females, women, whatever term you want to use, playing Dungeons and Dragons. Thank you very much.
And it's not just you dressed up as a character, right?
No.
Okay.
Well, I just think it's...
Well, I completely agree with
we'll
you.
Talk about that later.
The first generation is more about the game, and now it's evolved to be more about the story. And maybe there's still that internal conflict of where's the balance between the two. But I think if anything, the game benefits more from being a story. So what they need to do is add more game elements to it and not lessen the story elements, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And there's different things. I think that's where I probably need to do a better job. I don't know what the equivalent version of. It's like watching 1950s football and going, "This is what football was."
Right.
3 yards in a cloud of dust.
Just so
or
you know,
rugby,
that's how
or
you
whatever.
sound to us too. You see,
Right.
back when they first made it, they didn't intend
Yeah,
for
and
all this
now-
fancy
God,
bobbles and
what do you mean they can't tackle the quarterback?
Jibber
They can't tackle the. Yeah, it's jibber jabber.
you can't
exactly.
even clobber
so,
the guy in the head anymore.
Yeah, you can't paralyze people. What's wrong with that? Where have we gone to?
Well,
so,
and
yeah.
I guess to make my point, what I would like to see them do is in their storytelling incorporate more ways for the players to be involved in, whether you have more roles in your story, or I don't know how they could do it. There's a lot more clever people that work on it than me, but that way you still have the story, but then people are still active in the story. They're not just sitting there listening to you
Right.
paint the picture or whatever. And I think maybe that's where my point comes in, that you develop the story in such a way that people actually have to make decisions based on it. And it's probably going to require a lot more work, to be honest. And that's part of the problem with being a DM. And I know you guys said you use
Yes.
2 DMs sometimes. I'm sure that makes a world of difference.
Yeah, it helps if you have someone to help with you. But the ones who do it well, they have the ability to give a space for the players to change the narrative and not be so in love with what they came up with, and allow the circumstances to flesh it in. And that's whether it's 5th edition, 1st edition, all these other games, when the players and the person who provides the story, the referee, when they work well together, it can be great. The problem is, like all hobbies, there's that nirvana that you get maybe 5% of the time. The other 90% of the time, it's
Chasing
reading
that.
about it. Yeah, you're chasing that. You're chasing that high that you had the one time when it was perfect, everything worked great, and most of the time it's, you're haggling at the inn to save 3 coppers at a beer kind of thing.
And you're telling everyone else about the one great moment you had, and everyone's like, "Oh,
Right.
he's
Right.
told us about this ranger 50 times."
As Chris Rock said, go get kidnapped and get some new stories. So that's
Well, I think that just as a whole, I think it just really speaks to how good like the game is, that it's that pervasive and it's making such a resurgence, because it's solid from the get go. And then you have the technology and the different like ways that people can interact, like maybe through like Skype or through like streaming it so other people can see what others are doing, or you have like that dungeon creation website. So it's like you just have easier tools around the same just foundation of the game that hasn't necessarily changed in terms of how it's done. You just have things that make it easier and more convenient.
It's interesting too,
Absolutely.
because there's that new Black Mirror, which I haven't seen yet, but it involves having to make choices with the story of how it's going to end, and it makes me wonder if this is kind of an influence too of the whole Dungeons and Dragons, where people have an input on how the story goes. We've even seen books. R.L. Stein used to do books like that, where it's kind of like a choose your own adventure.
Yeah, and the next step is going to be, will artificial intelligence, will the Turing test for being a DM come? Because right now, you hit the wall. Whether you play Divinity, there's some part of the world you can't, you stop and there's the invisible wall. And in theory, when you play with other players, there is no invisible wall. If you have a competent game master and you have competent players, you can go everywhere. When will artificial intelligence provide that, so that and when the computers will just play with each other and we watch the story on Twitch?
Yeah, I mean, they're already making movies, so it's not a far
I
stretch.
think that just speaks to how easy these movies are to make.
Yeah, well, that's true. And then we'll really know that the computers are behind this, and of course they're being run by Satan.
Right. That puts a nice bow on it.
That's right. So for my listeners and those who may be checking in, how do they reach out to you guys? What's the way to connect to you all?
Website smogandthenog.com. Social media for Instagram and Twitter is all at smogandthenog. We do encourage people to just reach out to us through emails, smogandthenog@gmail.com. Any feedback on this episode or others, or anything like that, just reach out. That's kind of the best way.
Okay. And for us, GrogTalk at GrogTalk at Twitter. We're working on GrogCon, which is our convention. So for those who want to watch what this craziness is, if you're in the Orlando, Florida area in October, we're on YouTube, Twitter. We have our website, GrogCon, Google Play, iTunes. Still looking for ideas, always needing that. And hopefully we'll get some good reports from Dan, who will be up in GaryCon, which is named after Gary Gygax, the founder, in Wisconsin in March. How exciting is that? Sounds awesome.
It is exciting.
So on behalf of the folks here at Grog Talk, I want to thank you guys. This was a lot of fun. We need to do it again when you guys come up with another thing that I can introduce grognard, which again, for those who don't know what a grognard is it's an old, it's almost a pejorative word for an old school war gamer kind of thing is the idea of it. So
I wondered.
Yeah, so that's what a grognard is. It's kind of how we played it back in the day kind of thing. So I embrace that, and I'm okay with it. So if there's something else I can help you guys with, or at least we can have, because this was great fun, I had a great time, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Looking forward to the next podcast. So on behalf of Dan, who's not here, we'll see you later.
This has been